All right, so now we're gonna start sewing our blocks together. And I hope your nerves are a little bit more relaxed for foundation paper piecing. Trust me, it's super, super easy. You're also gonna need to pre-cut your fabric, and the measurements are in the pattern that you should have downloaded. And you also have your foundation paper piece template. And you have your cardstock that you're gonna need to use for this exercise, as well as some pins, your rotary cutter, and your ruler. I've pre-cutted my fabric here and I have it broken out in the actual pattern. So you can see there's two smaller flying geese blocks here. There's a larger, more triangle shaped flying geese here in the center. And then again, two more smaller ones up here at the top. So I've sort of laid out my fabric in the order of the blocks. So one thing to point out, as I mentioned before, you have it numbered and you're actually going to be sewing in the number order. It's sort of like paint by number, if you will. And we're going to start with the number 1 block. So what you do is you bring your light box over. And the cool thing with foundation paper piecing is you're actually going to be sewing on the black line. So you're going to put your fabric on the back side of the fabric so that you can sew right sides together, if you will. And you can see here, you can still see your lines with the light box. And if you don't have access to a light box, you can also use your overhead kitchen light. Any sort of bright light surface works really well. Just be careful when you're holding it up because sometimes the fabric and the paper might slip, but that's why we like to use our pins. So you can see here the reverse. You can see this is block number 1 in this triangle here, and then our little wings, if you will, are 2 and 3. So we're going to start with our first fabric choice. And again, it's totally up to you. It's all subjective in which fabric you want to use. But you'll note in the pattern that I've listed which ones are the small flying geese and which ones are the bigger flying geese. So let's start with this star. And again, you're going to put right sides up. Okay. And I like to cut my fabric a little bit wider than what you typically need. And I know with foundation paper piecing, it's sort of wasteful in a sense, but I like to have a little bit of room when I'm working with foundation paper piecing so that I don't make a mistake. And you'll see here my fabric covers the triangle, our triangle number 1. And then I also have a little bit of room over here for our seam allowance. And the seam allowance is already built into this template for you, which is great. And now I need number 2. So I'm going to pull my number 2, which is my background piece. And similar to what you would do when you're piecing together regular quilt blocks is kind of what you do with foundation paper piecing as well. And you're going to make sure, so when you overlap 1 to 2, that you leave enough room for your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so this, you're going to be sewing on this black line. And then right sides together. So if you have a printed background, you want to make sure that it's right sides to your number 1 flying geese block. And then let's see. Yep, and that looks like I have enough for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And just for a little bit of added security, you can pin it in place. And I'm pinning right in the middle of that number 1 block. So that way my machine presser foot doesn't hit it and then I don't sew over it as well. And what I like to do is give a little check. So I check the back as well. And you can see here, so we're going to be sewing on this line here. And you can see the white background piece. There's enough of a shadow there of a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let's take this over to the machine and sew it. Now I've preset my machine with my 9014 needle, which I think is perfect for foundation paper piecing. I'm also adjusting the stitch length, which is really critical when you're doing foundation paper piecing. I've lowered this machine's to a 1.4, and that will help when you tear the paper away. It'll make it a little bit easier. Okay, so now that it's in the machine, you're gonna lower your presser foot. And I like to start and stop off of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, just gives me a little bit more room when I go to trim down the seam allowance. And you're just following the line. You can go as slow or as fast as you want. Okay, so now we're getting to this point, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch off of it. Okay, great. So now you have your stitch line here. We need to trim it away. You can remove your pin if you've put a pin in there. I would definitely recommend pinning if you're a beginner to foundation paper piecing. So you're going to flip it over with your lined side of the template facing you. And this is where your cardstock or greeting card comes in handy. It gives it a little bit more security. So you're just going to place it up against the line that you sewed on the template. You're going to fold back the paper, give it a good crease. Then you're going to take your rotary cutter and your ruler and you're going to trim 1/4 inch away. And you can see here, this ruler has the 1/4 inch mark. You're going to line that up with the edge of your template and give it a good cut. Okay, so you can remove your cardstock. And this is a time when you can give it like a good little finger press. But I actually like to press mine with my iron. And I'm using my iron with no steam because steam will wrinkle the paper and it might make it a little bit difficult when you're going to sew the rest of the blocks. So you just give it a good press. All right, now you're ready to add your other wing. So let's bring back our light board here. Okay, so there's the first one, and there's still our background. So now we're going to add our second wing. You're repeating the same as you did for the first one. You're going to give yourself some room for that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you can see the shadow of the line underneath with your light board. You can pin it in place. You can freehand it, but again, recommend if you're new that you pin it in place. We're going to flip it over. Make sure we have enough for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I've given myself a little bit of room past the point here and the seam allowance just to make sure. So let's sew this into place. Again, starting off of the seam allowance, and then we're just following the line. And we're going to stop a little bit off, like around a 1/4 inch. Bring this over here to our cutting mat. Removing our pin. Using our cardstock. I'm going to place it on the sew line. Flip it over. Now this is where it gets a little interesting. So you see the fabric flips up, and that's because you've sewn over that point and a couple of intersections of fabric. All you're going to do is gently just pull out those stitches. And it doesn't really do anything to your block, it still stays in place. That was just your added security that we added in. So we're going to get that up there. Same thing as before, you're going to take your ruler, we're going to trim away our 1/4 inch seam allowance or add in our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Get rid of our scraps there. Give it a good press, finger press. Take it to our iron. Okay, so now that we've done that, that's our first flying geese, and it doesn't really look much like a flying geese block right now, but trust me, once you build to it and you trim away your seam allowances, it will really start to look like your flying geese. So let's keep going and make our next one. So there are 2 skinny flying geese, then there's a wider one, and then 2 more skinny that make up this block. And what I've done is with the pattern is that I've alternated my tone on tone. So this one I'm using the tone on tone gray with the stars. So next I'm going to use the tone on tone with the triangle. And again, right sides together, so you're going to have your fabric up. Similar to what you did with these 2 winged sections of the flying geese, you're going to overlap the skinny block a 1/4 inch, so you can see your line is here. And this is where it's going to intersect, and that's where you're going to get your perfect point. Pin it in place. And take it to the machine. And we're sewing on this line here. So we're going to start 1/4 inch off. We're just going to follow that line. It's kind of paint by numbers, but with fabric and paper. I'm going to sew over the intersection. And then stopping 1/4 inch off in our seam allowance. Okay, so now we're going to trim that back. Here's our pin. Again, we have a little bit of a bulk there, so we're just going to remove those stitches. Insert our cardstock. And again, you might get the hang of it and you might want to take the cardstock away. You might not even need it. It's great when you start to use patterns that have a little bit more complexity to them, especially tiny little foundation paper piecing blocks. We're going to trim away our 1/4 inch. Line that up. And again, these are some great scraps. You can use this for a smaller project if you want to save them. We're going to fold this guy back. And you'll start to see here, look at that amazing flying geese point. Isn't that great? This is why I love foundation paper piecing. Okay, just going to give that a good press back. All right, now we need to add our wing sections to this little guy. Okay, so that was 4. Now we're going to do 5 and 6. So overlap at 1/4 inch. Pin it in place so it doesn't move on me. All right. Still just following that line. Insert our cardstock. And again, removing that bulk from those 2 seams that overlapped. Making sure everything's flat. The other thing that sometimes happens is when you're going super fast and you're really getting into it, you actually might catch this and it might flip up on its own. So just be careful it doesn't happen because it's a pain to have to rip that out and start over again. And say a few choice words when that happens. Okay, let's trim away our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Oh gosh, this is starting to look so good. Okay, let's add our next one. So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're up to 6. Again, overlapping to make sure we're covering all of our seam allowances. Pin this bad boy in place. And sometimes what happens too is this one might get a little, wrinkly, if you will, under here. So just make sure everything stays nice and flat so you don't have to rip anything out. Okay. So now we're going to sew this section here. Again, starting off of our seam allowance. Just following the line still. So we can trim this line down. And again, you're going to pull these threads away. Give it a good crease. Take your ruler. Trim away our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay. Give it a good finger press. And this is where you can really start to see the flying geese take shape. So take this over and give it a good press. All right, so now we're going to add our 3rd triangle, or our flying geese. And this one's a little bit bigger, so this is where you're going to need your bigger fabric. And you can see here, so here's our first one, here's our second one, and this is the 3rd one that we're going to do here. And this fabric will be a little bit bigger. We're just going to overlap. There's our line. So we're going to overlap a 1/4 inch. Or a little bit more, just to give yourself some room. And then we're going to pin this one in place. This one's bigger. Another thing to point out too, because there's a little bit more room with the fabric, you can actually trim this fabric down. Just make sure you don't cut into your seam allowance, but you can trim this fabric down if it's getting in your way. Sometimes it will get caught underneath, but just you have to be cautious. So let's sew this one down. Just following that line. Going over the 1/2 inch. Okay. Pull out our threads there. Make sure everything's nice and flat. Trim our 1/4 inch. Get rid of our scraps. Okay, give it a finger press. Now we'll press this guy back. Okay, bring back our light board here. All right, so now you have your 3rd triangle placed, sewn into place. So now we're going to add our wing sections, which would be, 8 and 9. And so then you'll need the bigger background piece. Again, giving yourself that 1/4 inch because you're following that line, making sure you have room on each side of it. And we're going to pin it in place. There's so many great resources for foundation paper piecing. There's a lot of really great templates out there. There's some that are super beginner friendly that would be great for a kid because you follow the line for sewing, so it's a great exercise to do with your kids. Okay, so we're going to sew this. Again, just following that line. 1/4 inch away. Turn this guy back. And again, once you get in the groove, you might not need the cardstock. And sometimes naturally, depending on the complexities of the template, the paper will just fold itself. And because we're using a smaller stitch length, it's going to make it so much easier when we go to remove the paper. Okay, so we're going to trim away here. Okay, now we'll add our next section, which should be number 9. And again, you just want to be careful because sometimes the bigger sections will tend to sort of ripple up and you might not quite catch it all. Just make sure everything's flat That's why I like to press as I go. There are some tools out where it's sort of like a little rolling pin that you can use for foundation paper piecing, but I prefer to use my iron. Okay, so this is section number 9. There's our line that we're going to sew on. Give it 1/4 of an inch. Pin this bad boy in place. Make sure you catch the paper. Okay. Pulling back the thread. Make sure everything's in there nice and tight. And then we'll trim away our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And there you can see that the third flying geese start to take shape, or this triangle shape here. It's really cool. And again, you're not losing any of your points that you sometimes might with regular traditional flying geese piecing. Okay, give it a good press. Now we're going to add the third skinny flying geese block, which is number 10 here. And I am only using 3 fabrics. There's this bottom fabric, then there's a secondary fabric, and then the bigger triangle flying geese block is a different fabric. And what I did with this pattern is actually just repeated the top 2. So your number 1 flying geese will actually be your number 10 as well. And then your number 2 will be your number 13. And you can mix and match. You can do whatever you want to do. It's totally up to you. I just like the consistency of the matching. And because this is tone on tone, it could be a different shade of gray. There are so many shades of grays. Okay, so we've made sure that we have our 1/4 inch overlap. We're going to sew this down. We're going to keep going, adding our wings now to number 10. All right, now you can see we have 1, 2, 3 of the flying geese blocks here. You'll see this when we trim away our seam allowance, and now we're going to make our last one. Okay, so now you've sewn all your pieces to your foundation paper. The next thing is to trim it out so that you actually have the quilt block. And you'll see here, there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance already built into this template. And all you're going to do is take your ruler and line it up with the outside line here to the outside of your ruler. And then I like to give myself a little double check and actually line up my 1/4 inch marking on my ruler on this secondary boulder line here. And that way I have an accurate 1/4 inch. Okay. And then you're just going to trim it away. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, you're cutting paper with your rotary cutter. Well, the truth is, I actually have a couple of rotary cutters I keep around, and one I use specifically for foundation paper piecing. That way, you know, it doesn't dull the blade for every project. Because you know there are fabric scissors and there are paper scissors. And we yell at our significant others when they use paper scissors for fabric and vice versa. Okay, last one. All right, look at that. There's your first block. How cool is that? See, it was super easy. Didn't really take a lot of thinking or a lot of effort, and you get the most precise flying geese blocks. So for this project, you're going to need to make 3 of these. Now, there's some debate out there of whether or not to leave the paper in when you join the blocks together or to remove the paper. It's totally a personal preference. I actually like to remove the paper before I join them. To me, it is less bulky because really you're going to be sewing along this, thicker line here. That's where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is. But for smaller projects like this, I actually prefer to remove the paper. And it's quite simple. I just remember to go the opposite of how I sewed. So if my last block was 15, my last section was 15, then I remove 15 first. And because we've used a smaller stitch length, it actually should come out pretty good. It's almost like the sound of a checkbook, a check being taken out of a checkbook. But we don't use checkbooks anymore. Ta-da! There's your first Summer Sunset foundation paper pieced block. And you can see your seam allowance is already built into it, so this is the width plus the seam allowance. And sometimes I'll give this another good press, sometimes I'll use a little bit of starch on this, but otherwise you're good to go. You just have to make the other 3.